The thundering crack of the stagecoach axle shattering echoed across the Nevada desert like a gunshot, followed by the terrified screams of passengers as the vehicle lurched violently to one side. Catherine Zimmerman clutched desperately at the leather seat strap as the world around her dissolved into chaos, wood splintering, glass breaking, and the frightened whinnies of the team of horses dragging them to their doom. It was June 1876, and what should have been a routine journey from Sacramento to Virginia City had turned into a nightmare just 40 miles outside of Lovelock, Nevada. The merciless summer sun beat down on the rugged landscape as the stagecoach finally came to rest at the bottom of a shallow ravine, its wooden frame twisted beyond recognition. Catherine awoke to the taste of dust and copper in her mouth. Pain radiated from her ankle in violent waves, and her once pristine blue traveling dress was torn and stained with blood, some her own, some belonging to the other passengers. Disoriented, she pushed herself up on her elbows, taking stock of the carnage around her. The driver and shotgun guard were nowhere to be seen. 2 male passengers lay motionless near what remained of the coach door. An elderly woman Catherine had been sitting across from was moaning softly, a deep gash visible on her forehead. "Hello," Catherine called out, her voice raspy from the dust. "Is anyone able to help?" Only the desert wind answered her as she dragged herself from the wreckage. The elderly woman's moans had stopped, and Catherine feared the worst as she checked for signs of life among the passengers. None had survived except her. Tears streamed down her face, cutting clean lines through the dust coating her skin. The stagecoach company had warned them about the possibility of bandit attacks, but no one had mentioned the dangers of a poorly maintained vehicle. Now here she was, a 22-year-old schoolteacher from Boston, stranded in the Nevada desert with a severely twisted ankle, limited supplies, and no help in sight. Catherine had come west to take a teaching position in Virginia City, carrying everything she owned in 2 trunks that now lay scattered across the ravine. She managed to gather a small canteen of water, some hardtack biscuits from her reticule, and a shawl to shield herself from the sun. As the reality of her situation sank in, panic threatened to overwhelm her. The stagecoach line knew their approximate route, but it could be days before anyone came looking, and without water, she wouldn't last long in this heat. The sound of hoofbeats caused her to look up sharply. Through the heat haze, a lone rider approached. Catherine felt a surge of relief, quickly tempered by caution in the west. Not every stranger was a savior. The rider brought his horse to a stop several yards away, eyeing the wreckage with a practiced gaze. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. His dark hair peeked out from beneath a well-worn Stetson, and a week's worth of stubble covered his jaw. A rifle was secured to his saddle, and a revolver sat holstered at his hip. "Anyone alive down there?" he called out, his voice deep and cautious. Catherine waved her handkerchief frantically. "Yes, please help me." The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, approaching carefully as he surveyed the wreckage. His eyes, a startling shade of green against his tanned face, narrowed as they assessed the scene before settling on Catherine. "Name's Henry Blackwell," he said, kneeling beside her. "Ranch foreman for the Diamond B, about 20 miles northwest of here. What happened?" "Catherine Zimmerman," she replied, wincing as she tried to stand. "The axle broke. We rolled at least 3 times. Everyone else is." She couldn't finish the sentence. Henry nodded grimly, understanding without her having to say the words. "Let me check your injuries, madam." His hands were surprisingly gentle as they examined her ankle, which had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. "Not broken, I don't think, but a bad sprain for sure. You won't be walking on that anytime soon." He glanced around, then back at the setting sun. "Nearest town's Lovelock, but it's a good 20 miles from here. Stage depot there has a telegraph. We need to get you to a doctor." 20 miles, Catherine echoed weakly, dismayed. Henry nodded, his expression serious. "My horse can't carry double in this terrain, not with how steep it gets between here and there. The wash is too narrow for a horse to navigate safely with 2 riders." He looked at her intently. "I can carry you." Catherine blinked in surprise. "Carry me? 20 miles? That's impossible." A faint smile touched his lips. "Not impossible, just difficult. I've done longer hauls with injured men during the war." He gestured to the bodies. "We should bury them first, though. It's not right to leave them for the coyotes." Despite her protests, Henry insisted on giving the dead proper burials. He used a folding shovel from his saddlebag to dig shallow graves, working steadily in the fading light. Catherine sat nearby, organizing what supplies she could salvage and fashioning crude crosses from the stagecoach wreckage. "You're not from around here," Henry observed as he worked. "Boston," Catherine confirmed. "I'm to be the new schoolteacher in Virginia City." "Long way from home," he commented. Catherine looked out at the vast, alien landscape. "Yes, it is." By twilight, Henry had buried all the victims and marked their graves. He gathered Catherine's salvaged belongings, a small carpet bag containing personal items and a few books that had survived the crash, and secured them to his saddle. "We'll rest here tonight," he decided, setting up a small camp a short distance from the wreckage. "Start at first light tomorrow. Travel will be cooler then." He efficiently built a small fire, then tended to his horse before preparing a simple meal of jerky and coffee. Catherine watched him move with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have ridden for help instead." Henry handed her a tin cup of coffee. "Bandits patrol these parts if I left you alone." He didn't finish the thought. "Besides, my pa raised me better than that." As night fell fully, the desert temperature dropped dramatically. Catherine shivered in her torn dress, drawing her salvaged shawl tighter around her shoulders. Without a word, Henry removed his coat and placed it around her. "You'll freeze," she protested. "I'm used to it," he replied simply, feeding another stick to the fire. That night, Catherine slept fitfully, her dreams filled with the terrifying memories of the crash. She awoke several times to find Henry still awake, his rifle across his lap as he kept watch. Dawn broke with a spectacular array of colors painting the desert sky. Henry was already up, preparing coffee and checking her ankle, which had swollen further overnight. "We need to get moving," he said, helping her to a sitting position. "I'll carry you on my back. It's the easiest way." Catherine felt embarrassment color her cheeks. "Mr. Blackwell, I can't possibly allow Henry," he corrected gently. "And you don't have much choice, Miss Zimmerman. That ankle won't hold you, and we need to cover as much ground as possible before the heat sets in." After a brief breakfast, Henry helped Catherine onto his back, arranging her arms around his neck and instructing her to hold tight. Her wounded ankle throbbed painfully as he lifted her, but his grip was secure and steady. "I'm too heavy," she protested as he settled her weight. Henry gave a short laugh. "I've carried calves heavier than you." He whistled to his horse, which obediently followed as he began walking, setting a steady pace across the rough terrain. Catherine was acutely aware of his broad shoulders beneath her arms, the solid strength of him as he carried her weight seemingly without effort. The morning hours passed in relative silence, broken only by the occasional direction from Henry about changing position to avoid cramping. Catherine marveled at his endurance as the sun climbed higher, bringing with it oppressive heat. "Tell me about Boston," Henry said suddenly, his voice steady despite the exertion. "Never been east of the Mississippi myself." Grateful for the distraction from her pain and discomfort, Catherine began describing her hometown, the cobblestone streets, the harbor filled with ships, the libraries and theaters. She told him about her family's modest home, her father's work as a printer, and her mother's passion for literature that had inspired Catherine's own love of teaching. "What brought you west?" he asked during a brief rest, where he carefully set her down in the shade of a large boulder while he checked her ankle and gave her water. "Adventure, I suppose," she admitted. "And necessity. My parents died last year, influenza. The house had to be sold to pay debts. Teaching positions are scarce in Boston but plentiful out west where few educated women are willing to venture." Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'm sorry about your parents." "Thank you," she said softly. "What about your family?" A shadow passed over his face. "Lost Ma to childbirth when I was 12. Pa raised me and my brother on our small ranch in Colorado. After the war, Pa passed. My brother took over the home place and I headed west. Been working the Diamond B for 5 years now." By midday, the heat had become almost unbearable. Catherine could feel Henry's shirt soaked with sweat beneath her arms, yet he maintained the same steady pace, stopping only briefly to drink water and ensure she was comfortable. "We should stop until evening," Catherine suggested, increasingly worried about his condition. "The heat is too intense." Henry shook his head. "No shelter here. Better to keep moving until we find some." His breathing was heavier now, but his voice remained determined. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine began telling stories from her childhood, then reciting poetry she had memorized, anything to distract them both from the grueling journey. She felt Henry's occasional chuckle rumble through his chest, and something warm stirred within her that had nothing to do with the desert heat. By late afternoon, Henry's pace had slowed considerably. Catherine could sense his exhaustion, though he never complained. When he stumbled slightly on a loose rock, she insisted they rest. "Just for a moment," he agreed, carefully setting her down in the shadow of a scrubby mesquite bush. He collapsed beside her, his breathing labored. Catherine passed him the canteen, alarmed at how little water remained. "You've been letting me have most of it," she accused, noticing his cracked lips. Henry shrugged. "You need it more." "That's not true," she protested. "You're doing all the work." He gave her a tired smile. "Been through worse." After resting for half an hour, Henry insisted they continue. The sun was beginning its descent, providing some relief from the heat, but Catherine knew he was pushing himself to his limits. "Tell me about the Diamond B," she urged as he carried her onward, wanting to keep him talking. Henry described the sprawling cattle ranch, the bunkhouse where he lived with the other cowboys, the seasonal rhythm of ranch life with its cattle drives, brandings, and the quiet winter months. There was pride in his voice when he spoke of the trust his employer placed in him as foreman. "Do you ever want your own place?" Catherine asked. Henry was silent for a moment. "Been saving for it. There's good land opening up near the mountains. Another year or two I might have enough for a modest spread." As twilight approached, Catherine felt Henry stumble more frequently. His breathing had become ragged, and she could feel the trembling in his muscles from the sustained effort. "Please, let's stop for the night," she pleaded. "There's a creek about a mile ahead," he replied, his voice strained. "Better to camp there." The last mile seemed eternal. When they finally reached the promised creek, little more than a trickle between rocks, Henry carefully lowered Catherine to the ground before collapsing beside her, his chest heaving. Concerned, Catherine dragged herself to the water's edge, soaking her handkerchief to wipe his face. Henry lay with his eyes closed, utterly spent. In the fading light, she could see the toll the journey had taken his sun-reddened face, the exhaustion etched in every line of his body. "You're killing yourself for a stranger," she said softly. Henry opened his eyes, meeting hers directly. "Not a stranger anymore, I reckon." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, an understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. Catherine looked away first, suddenly flustered. They camped by the creek that night, with Henry managing to catch 2 small fish that they roasted over a fire. It was the most delicious meal Catherine had ever tasted, or perhaps it was simply the company that made it so memorable. As the stars appeared in breathtaking profusion overhead, Henry pointed out constellations, explaining how cowboys used them for navigation on night rides. Catherine found herself watching his face instead of the stars, fascinated by the play of firelight across his features. "How much farther to Lovelock?" she asked as they finished their meal. "About 10 miles, he estimated. We should reach it by tomorrow afternoon if we start at dawn." Catherine nodded, acutely aware that their journey was already half over. The thought brought an unexpected pang of regret. Morning came too quickly. Henry seemed recovered after a night's rest, though Catherine noticed he moved more stiffly than before. Her own ankle remained swollen and painful, but the rest had helped. They resumed their journey as the first rays of sunlight painted the desert in gold. Henry carried her as before, but today their conversation flowed more easily, punctuated by comfortable silences that required no filling. Catherine learned that Henry had fought for the Union during the Civil War, had once traveled to San Francisco and found it too crowded for his taste, and could play the harmonica, though he claimed to do so poorly. "I've never met anyone like you," she admitted during a brief rest. Henry looked at her curiously. "How do you mean?" "Most men I've known would consider it beneath their dignity to carry a woman 20 miles across the desert." He shrugged, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Most women I've known wouldn't have handled this situation with half your grace, Miss Zimmerman." "Catherine," she corrected him. "I think we're well past formalities, don't you?" His smile widened. "Catherine," he repeated, as though testing the feel of her name. The terrain gradually changed as they continued, becoming less arid as they approached the more settled areas near Lovelock. They encountered a small stream where they refilled their canteen and rested in the shade of cottonwood trees. "Tell me more about teaching," Henry requested as they sat side by side, feet dangling in the cool water. "What made you choose it?" Catherine considered the question. "I love seeing the moment when a child understands something new, that flash of comprehension in their eyes. It's like watching a door open to a whole new world." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "My schooling was spotty at best. Teacher came through our area every few months. Rest of the time, Ma taught us from the Bible and whatever books we had." "Yet you're well-spoken and knowledgeable," Catherine observed. He looked slightly embarrassed. "I read when I can. Borrow books from the ranch owner's library sometimes." The conversation turned to literature, and Catherine was surprised to discover they shared a fondness for Sir Walter Scott's adventures. As they discussed favorite characters, she found herself seeing past the rugged exterior to the thoughtful, intelligent man beneath. By early afternoon, they could see Lovelock in the distance, a collection of buildings shimmering in the heat haze. The sight gave them renewed energy, but Catherine felt a strange reluctance as they drew closer to civilization. "What will you do after you've delivered me safely?" she asked. Henry adjusted her weight slightly before answering. "Head back to the Diamond B. Boss will be wondering where I disappeared to." Catherine nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment that rose within her. "Of course." The last few miles were traversed mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they reached the outskirts of Lovelock, people stopped to stare at the unusual sight of a man carrying a woman on his back, followed by a patient horse. The sheriff was the first to approach them. "What in tarnation happened to you folks?" "Stagecoach accident about 20 miles east," Henry explained, his voice weary. "This lady's the only survivor, needs a doctor for her ankle." Word spread quickly through the small town. Within minutes, Catherine found herself being carried into the doctor's house, while concerned townspeople peppered them with questions. Henry explained the situation with admirable patience despite his exhaustion. Dr. Wilson, a graying man with kind eyes, examined Catherine's ankle with practiced hands. "A severe sprain but no break," he confirmed Henry's earlier assessment. "You're lucky, young lady. With rest and proper bandaging, you should recover fully in a few weeks." As the doctor wrapped her ankle, Catherine kept glancing at Henry, who stood awkwardly by the door, his hat in his hands. He looked out of place amid the doctor's neat furniture, his clothes dusty and sweat-stained, his face reddened from sun exposure. "You need rest too," she told him firmly. "And medical attention for those blisters." Henry shook his head. "I'm fine, just need water and food." The doctor looked between them curiously. "You carried her 20 miles on your back." When Henry nodded, the doctor whistled low. "That's something you don't see every day." "He saved my life," Catherine said simply. After her ankle was properly bandaged, Catherine was installed in the town's small hotel. The Stagecoach Company representative arrived, expressing shock at the accident and assuring her that her passage to Virginia City would be arranged as soon as she was well enough to travel. He also informed her that there would be compensation for her lost belongings. Henry visited her that evening, cleaned up and wearing a fresh shirt. He looked different, more handsome, if that were possible, without the layer of trail dust. He brought her carpet bag and the few items he'd salvaged from the crash. "I should be moving on tomorrow," he said, standing awkwardly by her door. "Manager at the livery stable says there's a cattle drive heading north in the morning. They can drop me near the Diamond B." Catherine felt her heart sink. So soon? "Duty calls," he said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ranch won't run itself." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. "I don't know how to thank you," Catherine finally said. "What you did, carrying me all that way, it was extraordinary." Henry shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she disagreed firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most would have left me to ride for help if they stopped at all." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I couldn't have left you there, not alone." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. For a moment, Catherine thought he might say something more, but instead he cleared his throat and looked away. "The doctor says you should be able to continue to Virginia City in about 2 weeks, he said, changing the subject. "The stage line will arrange everything." Catherine nodded, fighting disappointment. "Yes, that's what they told me." Another silence fell between them, heavier this time. "Well," Henry said finally, placing his hat back on his head, "I wish you the best in your teaching position, Catherine. Those children will be lucky to have you." He extended his hand formally. Catherine took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, remembering how those strong hands had carried her so carefully across miles of hostile terrain. "Goodbye, Henry," she said softly, reluctant to let go. "And thank you again." He nodded once, then turned and walked out the door. Catherine stared after him, a hollow feeling expanding in her chest. She hadn't expected it to end so abruptly, though what else could she have expected? They were from different worlds, heading in different directions. Sleep eluded her that night. Every time she closed her eyes, Catherine saw Henry's face, felt the rhythm of his steady gait as he carried her across the desert. She remembered their conversations. The way his rare smile transformed his features, how safe she had felt despite their perilous situation. Morning brought no relief from her tumultuous thoughts. Catherine sat by the window of her hotel room, staring out at the dusty main street of Lovelock, wondering if Henry had already left town. A knock at her door startled her from her reverie. Hoping irrationally that it might be Henry, she called out, "Come in." It was Mrs. Davis, the hotel owner's wife, bringing breakfast. "How are you feeling this morning, dear?" the older woman asked kindly. "Better, thank you," Catherine replied, trying to hide her disappointment. Mrs. Davis set down the tray and lingered, straightening things that didn't need straightening. "That cowboy of yours caused quite a stir in town," she commented. "Carrying you all that way. Folks are calling it a miracle." "He's not my cowboy," Catherine corrected gently. Mrs. Davis gave her a knowing look. "Well, he's still in town. Saw him at the telegraph office this morning." Catherine's heart lifted unexpectedly. "He is. I thought he was leaving with a cattle drive. Changed his plans, apparently," Mrs. Davis said with a slight smile. "Something about sending a message to his employer." After Mrs. Davis left, Catherine ate quickly, then dressed as best she could while keeping weight off her injured ankle. Using the crutches the doctor had provided, she made her way slowly downstairs, determined to find Henry before he left town. The hotel lobby was empty except for Mr. Davis behind the desk, who pointed her toward the general store across the street when she inquired about Henry's whereabouts. Crossing the street was a challenge with crutches, but Catherine managed it, drawing curious stares from townspeople who had heard the story of her rescue. Inside the general store, she found Henry examining a selection of work gloves. He looked up, surprise evident on his face. "Catherine, should you be up and about?" "Probably not," she admitted, suddenly uncertain now that she was facing him. "I heard you were still in town." Henry nodded, setting down the gloves. "Sent a telegram to my boss explaining the situation. Thought I should make sure you were settled properly before heading back." Hope fluttered in Catherine's chest. "That's very considerate." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the shopkeeper discreetly moving to another part of the store. "I was wondering," Catherine began, gathering her courage, "if you might join me for dinner tonight. As a small token of my gratitude." Henry's expression softened. "You don't owe me anything." "It's not about owing," she insisted. "It's about wanting to spend more time with you before you leave." Something shifted in his eyes' surprise, followed by a warmth that made Catherine's heart race. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. That evening they dined in the hotel's small restaurant. Henry arrived wearing his best clothes, still rugged by Eastern standards but clean and presentable. Catherine had done what she could with her limited wardrobe, wearing the one dress that had survived the crash, carefully mended by Mrs. Davis. Their conversation flowed more easily than Catherine had anticipated. Away from the life or death circumstances of their journey, they discovered shared interests in history, nature, and music. Henry spoke of his dreams for his own ranch someday, while Catherine described her hopes of eventually starting a school of her own. "Virginia City has good opportunities," Henry commented. "Mining town with money to spend. They'll appreciate a proper Eastern-educated teacher." Catherine nodded, pushing food around her plate. "Yes, I'm sure it will be a good position." "But," Henry prompted, sensing her hesitation. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I'm not sure it's what I want anymore." Henry studied her face carefully. "What do you want, Catherine?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond the simple words. Catherine took a deep breath. "I thought I knew when I left Boston. Now I'm not so certain." She gathered her courage. "These past days have changed something in me, Henry." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "They've changed me too." Those simple words sent warmth flooding through Catherine. For a moment, neither spoke, the connection between them saying more than words could express. Over the next week, Henry remained in Lovelock, visiting Catherine daily. They took short walks as her ankle improved, shared meals, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. He told her stories of ranch life, the cattle drives, the dangerous work, the camaraderie among the cowboys. She shared her experiences teaching in Boston, her love of literature, her hope of making a difference in children's lives. With each passing day, the inevitable parting loomed larger. Catherine found herself dreading the moment when her ankle would be healed enough for travel, when they would have to say goodbye for good. On the 10th day after their arrival in Lovelock, Henry took Catherine for a longer walk, supporting her when the crutches became tiresome. They found a quiet spot under a cottonwood tree outside of town, where they could see the mountains in the distance. "I received a reply from my employer yesterday," Henry said after they had settled on a blanket he'd brought. "He's holding my position but needs me back within the week." Catherine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course, you have responsibilities. And you have a position waiting in Virginia City," he added quietly. "Yes," she agreed, though the prospect now filled her with a strange reluctance. Henry was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was uncharacteristically hesitant. "Catherine, I know we haven't known each other long, and I'm not a man of wealth or education." "Henry," she interrupted, her heart suddenly racing. He turned to her, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Let me finish, please. I need to say this." Catherine nodded, holding her breath. "When I found you by that wrecked stagecoach, I was just doing what any decent man would do. But somewhere between there and here, something changed." He took her hand in his. "I've never met anyone like you, your courage, your kindness, the way you see the world. I can't bear the thought of saying goodbye." Tears welled in Catherine's eyes as hope bloomed in her chest. "What are you saying, Henry?" He met her gaze directly. "I'm asking if you might consider a different path than Virginia City, one that includes me." Catherine felt as though her heart might burst. "Are you proposing?" A slow smile spread across Henry's face. "Not very well, apparently." He shifted position, wincing slightly as his still sore muscles protested, and took both her hands in his. "Catherine Zimmerman, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Joy bubbled up inside her, but caution tempered it. "Henry, what about your job?" "My position in Virginia City. I've been thinking about that," he said. "The ranch owner's been talking about expanding operations. Needs someone to manage a second property closer to Lovelock. It would mean starting smaller than I'd planned, but we'd have a home, a future." "And teaching?" Catherine asked. "Lovelock's growing. They need a proper school, a proper teacher. From what the mayor told me yesterday, they'd welcome you with open arms." Catherine stared at him in wonder. "You've been planning this?" Henry looked slightly abashed. "Hoping is more like it. I know it's sudden. I know there are 1,000 reasons why a refined Boston lady shouldn't tie herself to a rough cowboy. But I also know that when I carried you those 20 miles, it wasn't just your life that was saved." Tears spilled freely down Catherine's cheeks now. "Henry Blackwell, I would be honored to be your wife." The joy that transformed his features was something Catherine knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Henry gathered her carefully into his arms, mindful of her ankle, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar. They were married 2 weeks later in Lovelock's small church. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, captivated by the romance of their story. Catherine wore a simple white dress made by the local seamstress, and Henry looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new suit. The telegraph operator had sent messages to Catherine's friends in Boston and Henry's brother in Colorado. While none could attend on such short notice, congratulatory telegrams arrived throughout the morning of their wedding day. "Are you sure about this?" Henry asked quietly as they stood together before the ceremony. "It's not too late to change your mind. Virginia City would offer you more comforts." Catherine reached up to straighten his tie. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." After a simple ceremony, the townspeople hosted a celebration at the hotel. Music, dancing, though Catherine was limited by her healing ankle, and a feast made from contributions from every household in town made for a joyous occasion. As evening fell, they slipped away to the small cabin Henry had rented on the outskirts of town, their temporary home, until arrangements at the new ranch property were finalized. Standing in the doorway of their humble first home, Henry swept Catherine into his arms. "No 20-mile journey this time," he said with a smile, carrying her across the threshold. "I would walk 1,000 miles to be with you," she replied, meaning every word. In the months that followed, their love only deepened as they built a life together. Catherine established Lovelock's first proper school, quickly earning the respect and affection of both students and parents. Henry proved himself an excellent manager of the ranch's new property, implementing innovations that increased productivity beyond the owner's expectations. By the following spring, they had moved into a modest but comfortable house on the ranch land. Catherine planted a garden, filling it with both vegetables and the flowers she missed from the east. Henry built bookshelves for their growing collection, adding to it whenever he made trips to larger towns. On their first anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Nevada sky in brilliant colors, Henry presented Catherine with a journal. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find his somewhat uneven handwriting filling the pages. "I wrote down our story," he explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "From the day I found you at the Stagecoach to our wedding day, thought our children might like to read it someday." Catherine looked up at him, her heart so full of love she could barely speak. "Children," Henry's smile was tender, "if we're blessed that way." They were indeed blessed. Their first child, a son they named James after Catherine's father, arrived the following winter. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later. By their 5th anniversary, Henry had saved enough to purchase the ranch outright when the owner decided to retire to San Francisco. As the years passed, Lovelock grew from a small settlement to a thriving town. Catherine's one-room school expanded to a proper schoolhouse with multiple teachers, though she remained the beloved principal until she retired to focus on raising their third child, another boy they named Michael. Their story became something of a legend in the territory. The schoolteacher and the cowboy. People called it how he had carried her 20 miles across the desert, how love had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. On their 20th anniversary, with their children nearly grown, Henry and Catherine retraced the route of their first journey together. They rode fine horses now instead of traveling on foot, and the trail was more established, with several homesteads along the way where once there had been only wilderness. They camped at the creek where they had spent their first night all those years ago. As they sat by the fire, Henry took Catherine's hand, his touch as gentle as it had been when he'd first tended her injured ankle. "Any regrets?" he asked, the firelight illuminating the silver that now streaked his dark hair. "About not going to Virginia City, about choosing this life." Catherine looked at the man who had carried her not just 20 miles across the desert, but through 20 years of joy and hardship, laughter and tears, dreams fulfilled and challenges overcome. "Not a single one," she replied, meaning it as deeply as she had on their wedding day. That stagecoach accident was the most fortunate mishap of my life. Henry's smile was as warm as the day she had first seen it. Who would have thought that carrying a stranded Boston schoolteacher 20 miles would lead to the greatest journey of my life? Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart as full as it had ever been. It wasn't just 20 miles, my love. It was the journey of a lifetime. And as the stars emerged above them, the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their unlikely love story, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that the path that had led her to this moment, to this man, had been the right one all along. In the years that followed, their children gave them grandchildren, their ranch prospered, and their love continued to deepen. The story of how Henry Blackwell had carried Catherine Zimmerman 20 miles across the Nevada desert became a cherished family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. And though their journey had begun with a broken stagecoach and a perilous desert crossing, it had led to a lifetime of love that neither could have imagined on that fateful day in 1876.